What's up guys, this is your boy Adventuristo. Thank you so much for tuning in. In this video, we're going to compare the 4K footage from the Sony A7 III to the iPhone XS Max. Right off the bat, they look pretty different. Can you tell which is which? Side by side, it's a bit of a giveaway because the iPhone has that expanded dynamic range thanks to computational photography. It's also a lot more saturated. Punching in closer, we see that the iPhone is a little bit over sharpened, but both have really good detail. Zooming in real close, we actually see that there's not too much difference between the two pictures, which is kind of surprising given how different the sensors are. And because the A7 III is actually downscaling 6K to 4K. Here I've brought down the highlights and boosted the shadows of the A7 III image to match it closer to the iPhone XS Max. Here's the XS Max with its long lens. As you can see, the expanded dynamic range does a really good job, almost never blowing the highlights and retaining great shadow detail. The A7 III image looks more neutral, more balanced, and perhaps better to edit, but it's not the clear winner I thought it would be, and it may be less pleasing to some people than the iPhone. Zooming in closer, the first thing I still notice is the difference in dynamic range. Look how much more highlight detail and shadow detail we have on the iPhone on the right. Cropping into 1080p, we really are not seeing much of a difference here between the two images. I think it's absolutely incredible that an iPhone is keeping up with an A7 III at this point. Punching in super close, we still don't see a gigantic difference in detail between the two. However, the iPhone achieves this through a lot of processing of saturation and sharpness. Here's another super tight crop. There isn't that much difference because of the processing the iPhone is doing, however you can see a little bit more tonality to the A7 III image. Here's a different angle, and I think the iPhone's doing a great job with dynamic range and saturation, even if that saturation is a little bit artificial. The A7 III picture looks really nice as well, but we've lost some highlight detail and it's not as saturated. With the iPhone on the right, you can really see the difference that I'm talking about in this side-by-side shot. And here's the crop in to 1080, and we really don't see a lot of difference in detail at this point. And here's the super crop, where there isn't all that much difference, but what stands out to me is the highlight detail that we're seeing on the iPhone. And we can actually see a pretty big difference in the highlight area at the top left there. And like most images, we see a little bit more color in the A7 III image, but the iPhone makes up for that with higher saturation. Here's the 1080 crop. And we see, of course, a ton more highlight detail on the iPhone, but we're even seeing a little bit more shadow detail. And the iPhone's white balance is always a little bit warmer than it should be. Here's a super crop, and the biggest problem I see here is the over-sharpening with the iPhone and some noise in the shadows. But apart from that, pretty good performance. Here's a high contrast scene, and it shows that we have roughly the same amount of highlight detail, but shadow detail is superior on the iPhone. Cropping into 1080, we do see a little bit of noise in the iPhone shadows. The super crop reveals some shadow noise on the iPhone as well as some muddiness in the clouds. Here's a comparison with shadows boosted on the A7 III image. Now here's where we should see some real differences: nighttime low light shots. Remember, we've given the A7 III a disadvantage by using an f4 lens, and a super crappy one at that. Is it obvious which is which? Here's a side-by-side shot. On the left is the A7 III, the right is the iPhone XS Max. Amazingly, the highlights are much better controlled on the iPhone and there's more shadow detail. Punching into 1080, we can see that the A7 III has less noise, but also less dynamic range. In the super crop, we see what we were expecting to see all along: a lot less noise and a lot more detail on the Sony. Here's a comparison of the long lens on the iPhone with roughly equivalent focal length on the Sony, however shot at f5.6. This one's a bit of a giveaway because, as we know, the long lens on the iPhone is not as good as the shorter lens. Side by side with the iPhone on the right, we see tons of dancing noise, a lack of detail, but we still see the effect of the expanded dynamic range. Those highlights are totally in control. Cropping into 1080, we see that the iPhone is a muddy mess of noise and really lacks detail. Same story with the super crop, but that computational photography of the iPhone is working some magic on those highlights. Just for fun, I wanted to compare how they'd look if I boosted the shadows on both. Here they are. Okay, so you may have noticed the iPhone surprised me in just about all areas with its video performance. However, I came at this from an average guy point of view. If you're a camera nerd or someone who just wants the best, the full frame is always better, of course. If for no other reason than for the ability to have shallow depth of field, the ability to change lenses, and full control over the camera. However, for most people, cameras on phones are getting to a point where they can definitely replace cameras, even good ones. The reasons behind this go beyond hardware and specs. It's true that the iPhone's tiny sensor can't compare to the state-of-the-art full-frame sensor in the A7 III in terms of dynamic range, color depth, and noise, but companies like Google and Apple are putting all their resources into maximizing what these phone cameras can do. The immense amount of processing power in the iPhone, for example, allows it to do HDR photo processing that is very difficult to replicate in post, even for seasoned professionals. That same computational HDR tech is utilized in the expanded dynamic range feature we saw in this video, which effectively gives the iPhone more dynamic range than the A7 III, one of the best cameras on the market for 4K video. And then there's also the bokeh effect, which keeps getting better and better, and now in the iPhone XS Max even tries to replicate Zeiss bokeh. And amazingly, this isn't limited to photos. The Samsung Galaxy Fold has a very early version of this effect for video, which requires immense processing power, but that certainly does look like the future. Now, the iPhone applies a ton of processing to the image, yeah, some of which is very heavy-handed at times, but it's appealing for most people in most scenarios, and you don't really need to edit it at all. It looks pretty good as it is. In fact, it's so good that I chose to get rid of the RX 100 Mark V I had because I felt it wasn't worth the effort to charge and carry an extra device when the iPhone's results were so decent. And now, with triple camera smartphones, we're getting close to the point that a phone can replace a camera, even an APS-C one with a kit zoom. These phones, with an ultra-wide lens, a normal lens, and a telephoto lens, are so close to the normal set of lenses I like to have with me. For the A7 III, I like a 15mm Voigtlander, 24 1.4, 55 1.8, and 85 1.4. And the optical plus electronic stabilization on phones is excellent. You need to make sure you're shooting in the best picture profile and that you've experimented and set up your preferences. And then you have to massage the image in post to achieve the result that you like. Also, in order to get the most out of the sensor, we really need ultra-high bitrate 10-bit or 12-bit video to see as much of the color as possible, especially in a wide color gamut HDR world now. In a recent interview, Sony mentioned that they are focusing on computational photography and technology as their main differentiator from their competitors. I find this super exciting, and I really can't wait to see what that kind of tech can do for a full-frame sensor. Well, that's it for today. Stay tuned for more content coming up, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.